Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. Remember the story of my conference call with three major figures in Pakistan's economy? They apologized for Dubai's materialism, waste, and vain display. And I suddenly realized that Dubai's materialism, consumerism, and vain display were not a waste. They spoke without words on behalf of the Muslim world's tolerant, secular modernists. They were a silent voice for those who dared not speak. They were a rouser of the human spirit, and they were a lifter of the human sense of possibility worldwide. Starting with that phone call, something stirred inside my mind, a realization, a heresy, a revelation arising from the omniscope, from the timeline. What was that insight? What was that heresy? Materialism, consumerism, waste, and vain display are not inventions of humankind. They are built into the very operating system of the cosmos. They are part of nature's DNA. They began long before this universe gave birth to life. In fact, materialism, consumerism, waste, and vain display are clues to nature's way. They are clues to the secrets of her least explored and most important gift, her creativity. Let's start with materialism. Materialism is not a product of capitalism. It is not a product of patriarchy. It is not a product of the Western way of life. Materialism is a product of nature. Materialism goes back 13.7 billion years. Materialism goes all the way back to 380,000 years after the Big Bang. 380,000 years after the Big Bang, electrons and protons mated and formed atoms. Atoms are proton and electron teams. They are socialities. From those teams sprang brand new forms of group identity. Teams with one proton and one neutron generated a bizarre collective character that we call hydrogen. Teams with two protons and two electrons developed the shockingly new collective personality we call helium. And teams with three protons and three electrons produced the bizarre group properties we call lithium. Yes, hydrogen, helium, and lithium are group identities that sprang into being from the collusion of protons and electrons in teams. Now, what the hell is a group identity? You consist of 100 trillion cells, each of which has all it takes to be utterly independent. Not a single one of those cells has a clue that it is helping generate the identity that is you. In fact, more than 200 billion of those cells die every day, and yet your name and yourself, your sense of yourself, remain the same. Yes, somehow your identity arises over and above the 100 trillion individual cells of you, and like the you that you call yourself, an overarching identity springs from the teamwork of protons and electrons. One of those group identities is called hydrogen, another is called helium, and a third is called lithium. In roughly 330 BC, Aristotle told his pupils that if you break things down to their smallest parts, if you break things down to what he called their elements, and if you understand the laws of those elements, you understand everything you need to know. Yet the group identities we call hydrogen, helium, and lithium are unpredictable from the laws of their elements, the laws of protons and electrons alone. Hydrogen, helium, and lithium are group identities. They are the identities of groups, like the identities of football teams. The unique characteristics of the Boston Patriots do not emerge from just the quarterback or just one of the defensemen. The character of the Patriots emerges like a ghost from the interaction of all of the members of the team, and from that team's interaction with the other teams in its league. In the world of atoms, group identities like these are as hard and fast as the protons of which they are made, and as radically surprising. What is a group identity? At 6:05 p.m. on April 4th, 1968, a charismatic man stood on a balcony at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. His preachings had brought to life a group identity, the identity of the black community and of its white champions. But that man on the balcony was also the product of a group identity. He was the product of a group identity. Like you and me, he was 100 trillion cells, each cell totally unaware of the larger self it was powering. Then came a sniper's bullet and struck him in the neck. When that bullet hit, it only damaged a tiny percentage of the 100 trillion cells in this man's team. But something bigger died, the group's overarching identity. And with it died the voice of more than just one man. With it died the voice of the group identity of millions of human beings. The group identity of the millions was called the Civil Rights Movement. The group identity of the 100 trillion cells was known as Martin Luther King Jr. When protons and electrons come together in teams, they too give birth to group identities. Hydrogen, helium, and lithium. What do group identities have to do with materialism, consumerism, waste, and vain display? Everything. 380,000 years after the Big Bang, materialism began. It kicked off with social gatherings. Materialism kicked off with the birth of atoms. Up until then, the primary forces on display in this universe had been the strong force, the weak force, and the electromagnetic force. But the new atoms discovered they were being whispered to, recruited, and seduced by a force so weak it had been hidden until then. That force of summons and seduction, whispering to them, was gravity. Gravity, it would soon turn out, was the greatest materialist this cosmos would ever see. It was a social gatherer. It was the generator of its opposite, competition. Yes, the birth of the first atom set off a competition to the death. Gravity's appearance kicked off the era of something utterly unimaginable until then, the era of the Great Gravity Crusades. Teams of atoms competed. What did atom teams compete for? For a snatch and grab sociality, to kidnap, seduce, and recruit yet more atoms, to kidnap, seduce, and recruit and gather more and more material things. This was materialism. Masses of atoms pulled together in gravity balls. The gravity balls that grew the fastest snatched and swallowed gravity balls that grew more slowly. The big ate the small in what astrophysicists and astronomers call cannibalism. The biggest winners became galaxies. The smaller winners became stars. The winners in the number 3 slot became planets. And the runners-up became moons. In other words, a social force, gravity, led to materialism. Materialism led to competition. Competition led to cooperation. And cooperation led in its own strange way to the primal ancestor of pecking orders. Yes, pecking orders, dominance hierarchies, with galaxies on top, stars next in line, planets at number 3, and moons at the bottom. Competition and dominance arose in the first million years of the cosmos, all thanks to materialism. Not human materialism, cosmic materialism, and all without a capitalist, a patriarch, or a smokestack in sight, which hints that materialism, competition, and hierarchy may be stamped into the source code of this cosmos. Materialism, competition, and hierarchy may be stamped into Mother Nature's DNA. How can we tell? The materialism, competition, and hierarchy of the Great Gravity Crusades continue to this day. As you read this sentence, galaxies are gathering together in clusters. The biggest clusters are eating their smaller brethren. They are bulking up and becoming superclusters. Why? Because galaxy clusters are flocks in which galaxies gather like sheep, shepherded together by gravity. And these galactic flocks compete. They compete to suck in matter. They compete to become more materialistic than their peers. They compete to gather as much matter as they can, to gather enough to literally make a dent in space. It's true. The more massive you are, the more you can bend the space around you. And the bigger your dent in space, the more you can attract even more material stuff. But there's more to nature's materialism. Nature is a consumerist. who operates on an industrial scale. She does more than merely gather gargantuan masses of material stuff to make galaxies and stars. She manically mass produces stars and galaxies. She creates galaxies and stars by the billions of trillions. Then nature shows her delight in waste. A mere 3.5 billion years into the existence of the cosmos, nature casually kills stars off. She lets them shut down and die, or she turns them into the star explosions called supernovas. She turns them into careless, gaudy throwaways. Yes, nature sometimes celebrates death with astonishing fireworks displays. One way or the other, nature turns discarded stars into waste. Nature is not just a materialist, she is a consumerist and a force that trashes the place. But nature regards every form of waste as an opportunity. She turns the death agonies of stars, those showy wastes of material things, into amazements. She uses the incredible crushing power of star death to mash together 89 new forms of unwilling sociality, 89 new forms of atoms in the dying star's hearts. She crunches together unwilling protons and neutrons to create 89 new kinds of teams with 89 new forms of group identity. Those group identities include everything from iron, nitrogen, gold, and platinum to thorium and uranium, all elements far stranger than just the protons and neutrons at their hearts, and all elements created by brand new forms of sociality, all elements that emerge from the group identity of whole new kinds of teams. So this is a materialist, consumerist cosmos. This is a cosmos that loves throwaways and waste. And yet there is something spooky in the cosmos way of doing things. With every ornate display of throwaways Mother Nature creates, she makes something far larger than the sum of its parts, something unexplainable by the laws of Aristotle's logic, by the laws of 1 + 1 = 2, unexplainable by the laws of garbage in, garbage out, something far beyond the sum of the mere matter it contains, something that arises from social groupings, a hard and fast new reality that mere groupings produce. Nature generates new group identities, identities that hover like a ghost over the particles that make them up, identities like the identity of you, which will disappear someday in a single breath, despite the fact that most of your 100 trillion cells are still capable of functioning. Identities as distinct as that of Martin Luther King Jr. The identities we know as hydrogen, helium, lithium, carbon, oxygen, and gold. And even these flickers that rise from mere groupings are the fruits of one of Mother Nature's lusts, her materialism. This is Howard Bloom speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make. Or, want to know why? Ask how. And now for the materialistic, massively ergonomic little, anti-ergonomic little off button.